Victor Hale thought that morning would end with a signed billion-dollar expansion deal and another headline praising Hale Aerodyne as the most dominant private engine manufacturer in America, but he had no idea he was only minutes away from the most humiliating silence of his career. The executive floor of Plant 7 pulsed with controlled panic as red warning lights flashed across the central diagnostic wall, bathing polished steel and glass in an angry crimson glow. Outside, through the 40-foot observation windows, Victor could see his prized prototype turbine sitting motionless on the testing platform like a dead monument. $100 million in research. 8 years of confidential development. 3 governments waiting on licensing rights. And now, 27 minutes before a delegation of Middle Eastern investors landed by helicopter to witness the live demonstration, the machine had shut itself down without warning. Why is it still offline? Victor barked, his Italian leather shoes striking the floor with sharp, impatient snaps. Around him, 12 senior engineers stared at tablets, muttered pressure readings, and exchanged the kind of nervous glances that rich men never tolerated from highly paid experts. "We're trying to isolate the resonance fault, sir," one of them stammered. "Trying?" Victor's jaw tightened. "I'm paying this room nearly $4 million a year for solutions, not trying." The air conditioner hummed above them, but it did nothing to cool the heat of public failure building inside the glass command room. On the giant wall monitor, a countdown clock glared in merciless white digits, 26 minutes and 41 seconds until investor arrival. Every second felt expensive. Every beep from the dead system sounded like money burning. Victor ripped off his navy suit jacket and tossed it over a chair. His silver cufflinks flashed under the emergency lights as he leaned over the engineering console. "Restart sequence. We already attempted that twice." "Then do it again." A low mechanical groan rolled from the testing bay below, followed by another shrill error tone. "Failed." Someone near the back whispered a curse. Victor closed his eyes for half a second, fighting the urge to explode. This turbine was supposed to secure a global defense contract worth 10 figures. Instead, his own people looked like frightened interns. Then, in the middle of that expensive chaos, something almost insulting happened. A squeaky maintenance cart rolled past the open command room doors. Slow. Unhurried. Practically invisible. Victor turned, irritated beyond reason, and saw her. Grey work shirt. Oil smudges on the sleeves. Brown work boots. Hair tied back in a plain low ponytail. Clara Bennett, one of the overnight maintenance contractors, paused only because the flashing alarms had drawn her attention. She glanced once at the diagnostic monitor, then toward the silent turbine outside. Nothing about her suggested urgency. Nothing about her suggested she belonged in a crisis worth $100 million. She looked like the kind of woman executives forgot existed 5 seconds after passing her in a hallway. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying the pattern of warning codes scrolling down the screen. Then, in a voice so calm it almost sounded misplaced, she said, "That doesn't look like a software fault." The room actually stopped moving. One engineer blinked. Another let out a disbelieving breath. Victor slowly turned toward her, and then he laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not a stressed laugh. A sharp, amused billionaire laugh filled with disbelief that a maintenance woman had just interrupted his executive emergency. "I'm sorry," he said, spreading his hands as several men behind him smirked. Did the janitorial staff suddenly become aerospace consultants? A ripple of restrained chuckles moved through the room. Clara didn't react. She simply looked once more at the frozen turbine, at the pressure graph, at the pulsing amber warning near line 3. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Victor shook his head, still smiling with open contempt. "Lady, that machine costs $100 million, he said. "It contains more engineering in one blade than most people learn in a lifetime." He expected embarrassment. He expected her to mumble an apology and keep pushing that little cart into the shadows where people like her belonged. But Clara Bennett did something Victor Hale would remember for the rest of his life. She stepped fully into the command room, set both hands on the squeaky cart, and quietly said, "Then you may want to stop restarting it before you destroy the core." For 3 full seconds, nobody in Victor Hale's command room said a word. The laughter that had bounced off the glass walls a moment earlier died so completely that the steady chirping of the alarm system suddenly sounded twice as loud. Victor stared at Clara Bennett as if she had spoken in another language. Behind him, the senior engineers shifted uncomfortably, some offended, others intrigued, but none willing to defend a maintenance contractor who had just corrected the most feared billionaire in the building. Victor folded his arms across his white dress shirt, the expensive fabric pulling tight over a chest that rose with visible irritation. "Destroy the core," he repeated slowly, each word dipped in sarcasm. "Please enlighten us, MS. Whatever your name is." "Bennett," Clara answered. Her tone remained level, almost boring in its steadiness. That calmness irritated Victor more than defiance would have. He was used to people becoming nervous under his stare. He was used to apologies, stammers, and lowered eyes. Clara Bennett offered none of those things. She looked at the scrolling diagnostics instead of at him. "The resonance is not random," she said. "It is cycling every 11 seconds. Your restart sequence is forcing pressure back into line 3 before the lock valve resets." One of the younger engineers frowned and glanced down at his tablet. His fingers moved quickly. 11 seconds. He checked again. Then his eyes widened. "She is right," he murmured before he could stop himself. Several heads snapped toward him. Victor turned sharply. "Excuse me." The young engineer swallowed. "The pressure spike, it is repeating in an 11-second interval." The room shifted. It was subtle, but Clara felt it immediately. Smirks vanished. Shoulders straightened. Men who had dismissed her as background noise now looked at her as though they were seeing an object move on its own. Victor was not ready to surrender control of the room. "Lucky guess," he said with a cold chuckle. "Even a broken clock gets things right twice a day." Clara did not argue. She simply stepped closer to the central monitor, her worn brown boots leaving faint traces of machine dust on the polished executive floor. Up close, she studied the waveform with a concentration that looked disturbingly natural. "Who authorized the software patch last night?" she asked. The chief systems engineer blinked. "I did. We were recalibrating the thermal compensation values." Clara nodded once. "Then that patch is masking the real issue. This is mechanical drag, not software instability." Another engineer whispered, "Mechanical drag." Victor exhaled sharply through his nose. This is absurd. But now even he could hear the confidence gap in the room. His own experts, men with doctoral degrees and 6-figure bonuses, were beginning to look at Clara Bennett instead of him. And Victor Hale hated few things more than losing the eyes of a room. Outside the observation glass, the silent turbine sat under flashing amber lights while 2 ground crews waited helplessly on the steel platform. Beyond that, the distant helipad came into view through the morning haze. A security officer's voice crackled through the intercom. "Sir, investor helicopters are 20 minutes out." 20 minutes. Victor felt the number strike his ribs like ice. If this demonstration failed, the investors would pull. If they pulled, competitors would smell weakness. Markets would ask questions. Reporters would circle. His board would panic. One failed engine could stain a decade of dominance. He looked back at Clara, this plain woman standing beside $1 million in diagnostic equipment with grease on her sleeve and no trace of fear on her face. It was offensive how composed she seemed inside his emergency. "Fine," Victor said at last, the word leaving his mouth like a tax he did not want to pay. "You clearly enjoy hearing yourself talk. Tell me exactly what you think is wrong." Clara lifted her eyes to the frozen pressure graph, then toward the testing bay where the turbine sat like a wounded giant. "I do not think," she said quietly. "I know." Another silence fell, heavier than the first. One of the engineers actually leaned forward. Victor's jaw tightened. Clara pointed toward the lower maintenance corridor leading into the machine chamber. Your lock assembly inside the resonance housing is off alignment by less than 1 millimeter. Every reboot is making it worse. If you restart again, the core will seize. Victor gave a disbelieving laugh, but this time nobody joined him. And that was the first moment he felt something unfamiliar creeping under his expensive confidence. Doubt. Victor Hale did not like being cornered by certainty, especially when that certainty came from a woman whose name he had not known 90 seconds earlier. He glanced around the command room, searching for someone to dismiss Clara Bennett for him, someone to restore the natural order of expensive authority, but all he found were 12 engineers staring at the monitor with the uncomfortable realization that her diagnosis fit the data better than theirs did. The billionaire straightened slowly, rolling his shoulders as though posture alone could re-establish control. Less than 1 millimeter, he said, forcing a smile that looked polished and dangerous at the same time. You expect me to believe the future of this company is hanging on something thinner than a grain of rice? Clara met his sarcasm with the same maddening stillness. Precision engines usually do. A senior thermal analyst cleared his throat. Sir, if the lock assembly is dragging, that would explain the heat spike in Chamber B. Another added, and the failed resets. Victor shot them both a hard look, but the damage was done. His own team was now building Clara's argument for her. Through the observation windows, 2 test operators in orange safety vests waited below beside the dead turbine, glancing repeatedly toward the command room for instructions that never came. The machine sat under strips of pulsing warning lights, silent except for the intermittent hiss of cooling steam escaping from the vent channels. Victor could feel time pressing against the back of his neck. 19 minutes. In 19 minutes, investors worth several sovereign funds would step onto his helipad expecting confidence, innovation, and flawless execution. Instead, he was debating engineering theory with a maintenance contractor. He hated how absurd that sounded even inside his own head. Suppose I humor this fantasy, Victor said. Suppose you are right. What exactly are you proposing? Clara turned her attention to the lower machine schematic displayed on the side monitor. She lifted one finger and tapped the resonance housing section. Manual realignment from inside the chamber. Several engineers reacted instantly. Impossible. The heat is too high. There is not enough clearance. Clara did not even look at them. There is if the feed pressure is cut and line 3 is isolated. One of the younger engineers scanned the chamber dimensions on his tablet. His eyebrows rose. She could fit. Victor heard that sentence and felt his patience crack a little further. She could fit. As if that alone qualified this woman to crawl inside a machine no one else in the building understood. This is not a garage repair, he snapped. That prototype contains classified propulsion architecture. Clara finally looked directly at him, and there was something almost unsettling in her eyes. Not arrogance. Not fear. Just a tired kind of certainty, as if she had seen men like Victor Hale her entire life and found them all painfully predictable. Then maybe your classified propulsion architecture should not be handled by people who keep rebooting blind. One engineer lowered his gaze to hide a reaction. Another bit the inside of his cheek. The room was balancing on the edge of disrespect, and everyone knew it. Victor stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. His white shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows now, his platinum watch catching the red emergency lights as he pointed toward the testing bay. Do you understand what happens if you are wrong? Clara answered without hesitation. Yes. Do you understand what happens to me if this demonstration fails? For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Clara's face, but it was not sympathy. It was indifference. Machines do not care about reputations, Mr. Hale. The sentence landed harder than Victor expected. No one breathed. Somewhere above them, the intercom crackled again. Sir, helicopters are now 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. Victor turned toward the giant countdown clock. 14 minutes and 52 seconds, the glowing numbers seemed louder than the alarms. He looked back at his engineers. No solutions. No confidence. Just sweat, tablets, and silence. Then he looked at Clara Bennett, the plain woman with grease on her cuff standing in the middle of his executive command room as though she had every right to be there. Victor gave a single humorless laugh. It was the kind a man makes when pride and desperation finally shake hands. "Fine," he said. "You want to play engineer? Go prove it." Clara reached for a wrench from her squeaky cart, and for reasons none of them could explain, the entire room moved aside for her. Clara Bennett did not rush, and that unnerved everyone more than panic would have. While executives checked watches and engineers exchanged strained whispers, she simply lifted a flashlight, a number 9 wrench, and a slim calibration rod from the battered maintenance cart as though she were beginning an ordinary shift. The red alarms continued to pulse across the glass walls, but Clara moved through them with the unhurried rhythm of someone who trusted machinery more than people. Victor Hale followed a few steps behind, not because he trusted her, but because he trusted failure even less. The lower maintenance corridor opened with a hydraulic hiss, releasing a wave of trapped heat and the metallic smell of overheated steel. Beyond it stretched the narrow access tunnel leading to the turbine chamber, lined with silver pipes, electrical conduits, and blinking pressure indicators. The hum inside that corridor vibrated through the soles of expensive shoes and work boots alike. One engineer wiped sweat from his forehead. Another muttered, "Core temperature is still above 140 degrees. Clara kept walking. "Cut feed pressure to line 3. "We already reduced it." "Cut it fully." The engineer looked instinctively at Victor. Victor gave an impatient nod. "Do it." Fingers flew across a control panel. Somewhere deeper in the chamber, a heavy valve clanked shut, and the vibration dropped by half. Clara stopped at the maintenance hatch beneath the resonance housing and crouched down, shining her flashlight through a 6-inch inspection slit. She listened. That was the strange part. She did not immediately touch anything. She listened as if the machine were speaking in a language only she understood. Tick. Hum. Tick. A faint scraping pulse beneath the cooling hiss. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. "There," she whispered. One of the engineers leaned closer. "You can hear that?" Clara did not answer. She reached for the calibration rod and slid it through the hatch, measuring resistance with tiny adjustments of her wrist. The men behind her watched in complete silence. There was nothing theatrical about what she was doing, and somehow that made it even more unsettling. No dramatic declarations. No guesses. Just small, precise movements from a woman they had considered invisible an hour ago. Victor folded his arms, but his confidence was no longer clean. It had become a shield. "How long?" he asked. Clara withdrew the rod. 7 minutes if no one interrupts me." Victor glanced at the countdown clock reflected faintly on the corridor monitor. 11 minutes and 18 seconds, he swallowed frustration and gestured sharply. "Do whatever you need." Clara removed the outer access plate with 4 quick turns of the wrench. Hot air escaped from the opening, carrying the scent of scorched lubricant. She reached one arm inside up to the elbow, feeling along a cluster of hidden locking teeth no blueprint on the command floor had shown in useful detail. Her face remained expressionless, but her fingers moved with frightening familiarity. Left bracket. Secondary latch. Offset collar. There. A tiny metallic snag answered her touch. Clara exhaled slowly. Misalignment confirmed. The chief engineer stepped forward. "How is that possible?" "We inspected the assembly 3 times. Clara twisted the wrench inside the narrow cavity without looking back. "You inspected the visible assembly." Another quarter turn. A muted click sounded from inside the housing. Several monitors above them flickered as pressure. Values shifted. The young engineer holding the tablet blinked rapidly. "Thermal drag is dropping." Nobody spoke after that. Even Victor stopped asking questions. The corridor that had been filled with executive noise minutes earlier now held only the soft sounds of cooling fans, controlled breathing, and the occasional metallic tap of Clara's wrench against hidden machinery. She adjusted the collar another fraction, then pressed her palm flat against the turbine shell as if feeling for a pulse. "Prime the standby sequence," she said. "Do not restart until I count." Victor looked at her grease-streaked sleeve disappearing into the machine and felt a sensation he almost never experienced inside his own empire. Helplessness. Through the corridor glass, he saw the first investor helicopter appear as a dark shape descending through the morning haze toward the helipad. 11 years of acquisitions, ruthless negotiations, and engineered dominance had taught Victor Hale that every crisis could be solved by enough money and enough experts. Yet in that narrow steel hallway, with sovereign investors seconds from arrival, all of his money and all of his experts had gone silent behind one maintenance woman turning a hidden bolt by less than a millimeter. Clara kept her hand inside the resonance housing for another 3 seconds, fingertips resting against metal so hot it should have forced hesitation, but she showed none. She was feeling for movement, for resistance, for that almost invisible shift that told her whether the hidden lock collar had returned to true center. Around her, grown men with engineering titles and executive salaries stood as still as statues, watching a maintenance contractor do what none of them had managed to do with algorithms, emergency resets, or conference room shouting. The tablet in the young engineer's hand flickered with new numbers. "Thermal drag down 12%, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Another monitor chimed. "Pressure stabilizing in chamber B." Victor Hale did not celebrate. He had lived too long in the world of expensive disappointments to trust improvement before proof. His eye stayed fixed on Clara's arm buried. Inside the machine, on the calm concentration in her face, on the way she seemed almost disturbingly familiar with every hidden contour beneath the steel casing. "How do you know exactly where that assembly sits?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara did not answer immediately. She made one final adjustment, a tiny clockwise turn no larger than the width of a fingernail, and then withdrew her hand. Her knuckles were streaked with black grease, but her breathing had not changed. "Prime standby," she repeated. The chief engineer obeyed without waiting for Victor this time. That alone sent a quiet sting through the billionaire's pride. Commands in his facility had always flowed downward from him. Now every eye followed Clara Bennett. On the corridor display, standby indicators shifted from red to amber. Cooling fans deep inside the turbine began to spin in low synchronized pulses. Clara pressed her ear lightly against the outer shell. Hum. Tick. Hum. Smooth now. She nodded once. Good. Victor stepped closer. "That is it? You turn one hidden bolt and my prototype suddenly forgives 8 years of engineering." Clara reached for a rag from her cart and wiped her hand with measured slowness. "No," she said. "I corrected one mistake that should never have happened." The sentence hit harder than Victor expected because it carried no triumph, only fact. Before he could respond, the intercom crackled above them. "Investor convoy has landed on the helipad, sir. They are entering the executive wing." A current of panic rushed through the corridor. One executive cursed under his breath. Another looked toward Victor for instructions. The billionaire's mind split in 2 directions at once. Upstairs, he needed polished confidence, handshakes, and a flawless demonstration. Down here, he still had a $100 million machine that had not yet fully restarted. He turned sharply to Clara. "Can it run?" Clara looked at the turbine, then at the live pressure graph, then back at the sealed hatch. "Yes," she said. "If you do exactly what I say." Victor hated conditional trust, but he hated public humiliation more. "Do it." Clara pointed toward the control technician. "When I count to 3, initiate low ignition only. No full surge. Let the bearings settle for 6 seconds." The technician nodded so fast he nearly dropped his headset. Clara's eyes moved to the pressure panel. "Open auxiliary vent. Keep feed pressure under 60 psi. Another nod. The corridor had become a strange reversal of hierarchy. Degrees, titles, stock options, corner offices, all of it had gone irrelevant. There was only one voice now. Clara placed one palm flat against the turbine shell again, listening with her skin. Victor watched her profile under the flashing amber light and felt an irritating question begin forming in the back of his mind. Who was this woman? Nobody in maintenance talked like this. Nobody in maintenance commanded turbine restarts from memory. Nobody in maintenance looked at a classified prototype as if they had known it before everyone else forgot how to read it. Clara inhaled slowly. Ready, she said. The technician's fingers hovered over the ignition switch. Every person in the corridor stopped moving. Even the cooling fan seemed quieter. Clara's voice came low and precise. 1. Victor's heartbeat thudded in his throat. 2. The turbine casing gave a faint anticipatory tremor beneath her hand. Clara narrowed her eyes, listening to something none of them could hear. Then she said, 3. The technician slammed the ignition sequence, and for one suspended second nothing happened. Then a low rotational whir moved through the chamber, soft at first, like a giant machine waking from an unwilling sleep. Amber lights flickered across the control panel. Bearing 1 engaged. Bearing 2 engaged. Chamber pressure rising. Every engineer leaned toward the monitors at once. Clara did not move her hand from the steel casing. Hold it there, she said. Do not touch the main surge. The technician froze over the controls. The turbine continued spinning at low ignition, each revolution smoother than the last. On the tablet, the young engineer blinked twice and looked up in disbelief. No drag, he whispered. The drag is gone. Victor Hale heard him, but he kept his eyes on Clara. The woman had not smiled, had not shown relief, had not even looked surprised. She listened the way a pianist listens for a wrong note in a familiar song. 6 seconds passed. Clara lifted one finger. Now increase feed pressure to 80 psi. The order was obeyed instantly. A deeper hum rolled through the housing, stronger now, more confident. Pressure climbed. 40. 50. 65. 80. The giant turbine blades, visible through the outer inspection glass, began turning in smooth silver circles instead of the stuttering jerks from earlier. One executive let out an involuntary breath. Another engineer muttered, "This cannot be real." Clara ignored them all. Her eye stayed on the vibration graph. A perfect wave was beginning to form, clean and centered. Open primary ignition. The technician hesitated only because he knew what this command meant. Full awakening. If she was wrong, the machine would fail publicly in front of the arriving investors. Victor felt his palms dampen, an unfamiliar insult to his polished composure. Do it, he snapped. The switch flipped. A deep internal roar surged through the chamber as fuel met ignition and the $100 million prototype came alive with a sound so powerful it vibrated through the corridor walls and up into the soles of every shoe. The silver blades accelerated into a seamless blur. Control monitors flashed from amber to green one by one. Chamber stable. Thermal stable. Resonance stable. Core synchronized. For a second, no human being reacted because the mind takes time to accept what pride has already declared impossible. Then the chief engineer looked at his screen, looked at Clara, and said the words no one else had the courage to say. She fixed it. The corridor went silent. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of collective humiliation. Victor Hale stood motionless as green status bars filled every monitor around him. The machine that had nearly cost him the most important demonstration of his corporate life was running smoother than it had during the last certified test. And it was running because the woman he had mocked less than 15 minutes ago had touched a hidden assembly his experts never even considered. Clara finally stepped back from the casing and exhaled as though she had merely finished changing a faulty filter. She wiped the wrench clean, returned it to the maintenance cart, and looked toward the command display. You have your engine. Nobody answered. Above them, through the corridor ceiling speakers, the polished voice of the executive receptionist drifted faintly from the upper floor. Welcome to Hale Aerodyne, gentlemen. Mr. Hale will be with you shortly." Victor did not hear the rest. His attention had snagged on something strange near the open maintenance hatch. During the restart vibration, the loose inspection plate had shifted farther aside, exposing a narrow strip of inner titanium beneath the resonance housing. There, half hidden under years of heat discoloration, were tiny engraved initials. Victor stepped closer, squinting. "CB." He frowned. Not a serial code. Not a manufacturing mark. Initials. Personal initials. His heartbeat gave one hard thud. Slowly, very slowly, he turned toward Clara Bennett. She was already pushing the squeaky cart back toward the corridor exit, shoulders relaxed, as if the crisis was over and her part in it had never been worth discussing. Victor looked back at the engraved letters inside the machine, then at the quiet woman walking away from the $100 million miracle she had just resurrected, and for the first time that morning, the billionaire felt something colder than panic. Recognition beginning to wake. Victor Hale felt the blood drain from his face so subtly that no one around him noticed, but inside, memories were beginning to collide with the present in sharp, unwelcome flashes. 8 years earlier, when Hale Aerodyne had still been a hungry competitor clawing its way into elite defense contracts, there had been one engineer whose prototype concepts had changed everything. Not a public executive. Not a board member. Not one of the decorated men who now stood sweating in this corridor. Just a private contract systems architect whose designs arrived through encrypted submissions marked only with the initial CB. Those blueprints had been unlike anything Victor had seen at the time: cleaner airflow, tighter resonance control, more efficient thermal distribution. Revolutionary. Investors had called Victor a visionary for acquiring the patent family built around those designs. Financial magazines had praised his genius. Competitors had panicked. But the architect herself had vanished before Hale Aerodyne's full expansion, declining interviews, declining executive offers, declining every attempt at publicity. Victor remembered one furious conference call in particular. "Find this person," he had ordered his legal team back then. "Nobody walks away from a platform this valuable." They never did. The only thing left behind had been the initial stamped discreetly inside internal housings during early fabrication. CB. Victor looked now at Clara Bennett's retreating figure, at the plain grey shirt hanging loosely from her shoulders, at the maintenance cart squeaking softly over the steel floor, and his mind refused to accept the math even while the evidence assembled itself with merciless speed. The way she knew the hidden lock collar. The way she listened to the turbine by touch. The way she gave commands like someone who had not studied the machine but remembered it. "Clara," Victor said, the name leaving his mouth stripped of all earlier sarcasm. She stopped, but she did not turn immediately. That alone sent another strange chill through him. Most people spun around the instant he used their name. Clara Bennett made Victor Hale wait. When she finally looked back, her expression remained unreadable. The engineers glanced between them, sensing a shift they did not yet understand. Victor stepped toward her slowly. "Bennett," he repeated, this time almost to himself. "As in?" "Clara Bennett." Clara rested one hand on the cart handle. That is usually how names work. Under any other circumstance, such a dry answer would have offended Victor. Now it only sharpened the growing realization. He stared at her as if trying to reconcile two different photographs laid on top of each other. The invisible maintenance contractor. The vanished systems architect whose work had built a large portion of his fortune. "You designed the original resonance housing," he said. Not a question. A stunned conclusion. Several engineers visibly stiffened. The chief engineer blinked hard. "What?" Victor did not look at them. His eye stayed on Clara. Prototype submissions from the Bennett file. Internal cooling collar. Offset lock geometry. Adaptive feed venting. Every word came slower. He was hearing himself uncover his own humiliation in real time. Clara gave the smallest nod. "Those were my drafts." The corridor changed. There was no physical movement, but the atmosphere itself shifted as every educated, highly paid man in that narrow space realized they had spent the last 20 minutes doubting the woman who had conceived the machine they could not even restart. One engineer actually took a half step backward. Another looked at Clara with open disbelief, as though trying to understand how a legendary name from SEAL development archives could be standing in work boots beside a squeaky cart. Victor's throat tightened. You were offered an executive division. I declined. You disappeared. Clara's eyes held his, calm and almost weary. I left. Victor struggled to process the absurdity. And now you work maintenance. Clara glanced at the turbine humming flawlessly behind them, green light steady, billion-dollar credibility restored. Then she looked back at the billionaire who had laughed in her face less than 20 minutes earlier. Temporary contract, she said. I like fixing things that other people break. No one in the corridor missed the meaning behind that sentence. Victor Hale stood there, surrounded by his silent executives, while the full weight of his own arrogance settled over him like concrete. He had mocked a woman whose forgotten designs had made him richer. He had laughed at the one person in the building who understood his machine better than anyone alive. And for the first time in a career built on commanding rooms, Victor found himself standing in one with absolutely nothing to say. The silence did not last because silence rarely survives the arrival of money. From the upper level came the echo of polished footsteps, cheerful executive greetings, and the unmistakable murmur of wealthy men being escorted toward a promised triumph. Hale Aerodyne's international investors had entered the observation wing. Victor Hale blinked once, as though waking from a personal disaster he did not have time to feel. In less than 2 minutes, he would need to stand before men who controlled sovereign capital, smile as though everything had gone according to plan, and present a flawless engine demonstration powered by the woman he had publicly ridiculed. He turned to Clara Bennett, but his voice no longer carried command. It carried urgency wrapped in embarrassment. I need you upstairs. Clara's fingers tightened lightly on the maintenance cart handle. No, you need your investors upstairs. Victor exhaled. Even now she refused to step into his hierarchy. The chief operations officer rushed into the corridor, tablet in hand, face pale. Victor, they are asking technical questions already. They want to know why the prototype was delayed. Victor glanced once at Clara, then made a decision that would have been unthinkable 30 minutes earlier. Tell them the lead systems architect is joining us now. Every head snapped toward him. The operations officer looked confused. The engineers looked stunned. Clara looked mildly annoyed. I am not part of your presentation, she said. Victor lowered his voice, and for the first time that morning, the billionaire sounded like a man asking instead of ordering. Please. The word landed heavily because men like Victor Hale did not use it casually. Clara studied him for a long second, perhaps weighing whether his humiliation had reached a sufficient depth to be educational. Then she let out a slow breath and pushed the cart toward the elevator. The executive wing above looked exactly as expensive as Victor had intended, smoked glass walls, brushed chrome railings, imported stone flooring, and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the test platform where the turbine now spun in smooth silver perfection under the morning sun. 6 investors in tailored suits stood near the observation deck, flanked by translators, legal advisors, and 2 members of Victor's board. Their conversation stopped when Victor entered. He pasted on the practiced smile that had closed. Acquisitions across 3 continents. Gentlemen, welcome. Handshakes followed. Compliments followed. Then one investor, an older man from Abu Dhabi with sharp grey eyes, pointed through the glass toward the now stable turbine. We heard there was a technical interruption. Victor opened his mouth with the prepared corporate lie, but before he could deliver it, Clara's squeaky cart rolled into the executive wing behind him. Every polished head turned. The contrast was almost absurd. $1,000,000 watches. Hand-stitched shoes. And one quiet woman in a grease-marked grey shirt. Victor felt heat rise under his collar. This was not how elite demonstrations were supposed to look. Yet the turbine outside was running because reality had already rejected his preferences. The older investor glanced from Victor to Clara. "And who is this?" Victor swallowed his pride in front of everyone who mattered. "This," he said slowly, "is Clara Bennett." Clara gave a small nod, uninterested in ceremony. Victor continued, each word tasting like the dismantling of his own ego. "The original architect behind the resonance platform." The room changed instantly. Investors who had been politely distracted a moment earlier straightened with genuine attention. One board member nearly dropped his tablet. The translator paused mid-sentence. The investor with grey eyes looked at Clara with new respect. "The Bennett design papers?" he asked. Clara answered simply. "Some of them." A murmur moved across the observation deck. Victor heard it and understood exactly what was happening. Respect, the very thing he had denied her downstairs, was now arriving from the wealthiest men in the room without hesitation. The grey-eyed investor extended his hand to Clara before he extended it again to Victor. "Your cooling collar innovation changed the efficiency projections of this entire sector," he said. "I studied that file personally." Clara shook his hand once. "Then you know the machine only works when people stop forcing the wrong restart sequence." Several investors gave knowing smiles. Victor did not miss the subtle glance they cast in his direction. It was not mocking, but it was worse. It was understanding. In one elegant sentence, Clara had told the room exactly who broke the crisis and exactly who repaired it, and she had done so without raising her voice. Victor Hale stood beside her in his own glass palace, surrounded by men who now admired the woman he had laughed at, and he could feel control slipping from him in the quietest possible way. For the remainder of the investor demonstration, Victor Hale spoke less than he had in any major presentation of his career. Normally he controlled rooms with polished certainty, guiding conversations, framing numbers, shaping admiration before anyone else had a chance to speak. But that morning, every technical question drifted naturally toward Clara Bennett, and every answer she gave made the contrast more painful. She did not use corporate jargon. She did not perform. She simply explained airflow ratios, thermal lock tolerances, and resonance stabilization in plain, exact language that made men worth billions listen with the attentive silence usually reserved for proven authority. The older investor from Abu Dhabi asked 3 consecutive questions directly to her. A board member from New York began taking notes only when she started speaking. Even Victor's own chief engineer, who had spent years presenting himself as the intellectual backbone of Hale Aerodyne, stood half a step behind Clara like a graduate student near a professor. Outside the glass wall, the turbine continued spinning in perfect silver rhythm, every stable revolution quietly testifying to who had truly saved the day. Victor smiled when required. He nodded when expected. But internally he was being forced through a far rarer process than a financial negotiation. He was being made to witness his own misjudgment from every possible angle. After the contracts were verbally confirmed and the investors moved toward the private dining lounge, the grey-eyed investor paused beside Clara one last time. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "if you ever choose to return to executive engineering, there are firms across 3 continents that would clear entire divisions for your leadership." Clara gave him the same small nod she had given everyone else. "That is kind of you." He smiled. "It is not kindness. It is market realism." Then he turned and left. The board members followed. The translators followed. The polished parade of wealth and influence disappeared down the marble corridor until only Victor and Clara remained near the observation glass. The turbine hummed steadily outside, and the executive wing, so loud with money minutes earlier, became strangely still. Victor loosened his tie. He looked older than he had that morning. Success had taught him how to recover from failed deals, hostile acquisitions, market pressure, and legal attacks. It had not taught him how to recover from being morally smaller than the person standing in front of him. "Why did you come back here?" he asked quietly. Clara looked through the glass at the machine she had once designed in anonymity. "Temporary work between contracts." Victor gave a faint, humorless laugh. "You could have named your salary anywhere in this industry." Clara turned to him. And I could have spent my life in rooms full of men who think expensive watches make them intelligent. Victor flinched, not visibly, but enough. The truth had a way of bypassing wealth. He placed both hands in his pockets, searching for some version of authority that no longer fit. I laughed at you. Yes. In front of everyone. Yes. Victor nodded once, accepting the bluntness because he had earned it. I was wrong. Clara studied him for a moment. This was the point in most executive stories where forgiveness arrived quickly, where humility was rewarded with easy redemption. But real dignity did not move that cheaply. She simply said, "You were careless." Victor frowned slightly. Careless? Clara glanced around the gleaming executive floor, at the imported stone, the chrome, the wall-sized monitors built to impress men with too much money. Careless with assumptions. Careless with people. Careless with the belief that if someone looks ordinary, they must be ordinary. The words were quiet, but they settled into the room heavier than any shouted accusation. Victor lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time in years, he had no strategic response. No counter-argument. No acquisition. No check large enough to purchase immediate relief from the lesson. Clara reached for the squeaky cart handle again. Your engine is stable now, she said. But I would replace the lock assembly before the next full surge test. Victor looked up. Clara. She paused. He swallowed what remained of his pride and asked the only honest question left. Would you consider staying? Hale Aerodyne could use someone like you. Clara's expression softened only by a